Wow. I will take this. What an honor to be here. Thank you all for listening to me. Thank you to Anna and Kareem and Chris for inviting me. It's kind of a formidable task introducing this conference and following Michael. So I want to say thank you to everyone who's organized this. And I was invited because I am in the process of releasing a film called What is Democracy? And on May 7th, I finally have a day. The companion book, the sister book to this film is coming out. And the book is called Democracy May Not Exist, but We'll Miss It When It's Gone. And so these projects have been labors of love. And now it makes sense, right? People take for granted that it makes sense that I would be working on projects about democracy. But that wasn't the case when I began them. I first wrote an email to my producer, Leah Marin, from the National Film Board of Canada in 2013. And she responded so enthusiastically about this idea of making a philosophical film about democracy. And I don't think any other institution in the world would have accepted that as a pitch for a film, especially at that moment. So I just want to thank the National Film Board and call attention to the fact that it was because of what they do, that this is a production in the public interest about ideas and not market-driven, that I was able to undertake this film. So what is democracy? Obviously, the film does not definitively answer the question. That wasn't, I'm just gonna, if you come see it tonight, it's kind of a spoiler. And there are no car chases. It's a different kind of romance film. I think it's a film, it's not about, like this boy meets girl. It's about public love, actually, And so love is something I thought about a lot and I felt as I made the film. So I wanted to ask a deceptively simple question: what is democracy? And I started this project because I wanted to ask it for myself. And I wanted to ask it with others. I wanted to create a cinematic experience that would invite people to think. So we've always thought of this film as an invitation to think. I wanted to make a film that was a true exploration and not an exposition, that was an investigation, right? Not just like an expose of democracy's many flaws. And so I want to talk about this desire to prompt conversation and contemplation, because when I was trying to figure out how to rise to the occasion of this conference, I was a bit overwhelmed because all of you are engaged with this topic, right? Where, as Kareem said, there are elected officials and activists and scholars in this room and concerned citizens. So I think it's fair to say that we're all here because we have a shared interest in democracy. We're all concerned about it. I mean, does a single person in this room think democracy is doing great? No, okay. And so given the messed up state of the world, there was kind of a temptation in my mind to lay it out, right? To remind us how urgent the situation is. The crisis, we use this word crisis, and the film has a lot about sort of ancient Greece in it, and crisis is a word from the Greek, and it actually is a turning point in a disease where you either get better or you die. There's no, it's like, I always have that image when I hear that word, it's a really dire word. So, the crisis of capitalism and the concentration of wealth and how that undermines political equality, the extraction of resources and how that destabilizes the environment, and climate change, the legacy of settler colonialism and racism. I mean, there are all these problems that make this a really urgent conversation. And all of us might emphasize different threats and challenges to democracy, but the thing is that there is a fundamental consensus, and that's basically that we're here, that we would come to a conference called Democracy Exchange. And so, we are a little demos. We're a little demos in this room of democracy nerds, of people who think that word is relevant to them. And I guess what I was thinking about is the fact that, even 10 years ago, I never would have come to a conference on democracy. And even at that time, I was sort of a social justice filmmaker, engaged in politics around a variety of issues, but the word democracy really did not speak to me. And so that's kind of what I want to talk about, the fact that this word, and I think Michael got to this as well, that it leaves so many people cold, even people who should care about it. And, it wasn't even like that I was disenchanted with the word democracy, because I was never enchanted with it to begin with. And, I think it's like, part of it is growing up in the aughts. And so the big, George W. Bush, president of the United States, was bringing democracy to the Middle East. I think I also associated democracy with bureaucracy, with people who were sort of tweaking the margins instead of offering deeper solutions and galvanizing principles. It just seemed like something very mealy-mouthed and debased. I mean, Michael talked about this as well. So words like equality and freedom and revolution and socialism and liberation spoke to me, but the word democracy just seemed kind of beside the point. And it was it was a word also too. It's like presidents and prime ministers say it, and so do my anarchist friends, and North Korea calls itself a democracy. It's like this word, what does it mean? So many people use it. So I was, disconnected from democracy, and there are different ways. I think it's important to point out there are sort of different ways of being unconnected to democracy. So, I just want to distinguish my sense from another one. There was a recent piece in the New York Times that I thought was so interesting, and I don't know if there's data on Canada, but I just want to read this. And it's actually that the people who are the most hostile to the idea of democracy today, at least according to some studies, are actually centrists. Right? In the United States and Europe, middle-of-the-road centrists tend to hold the most hostile attitudes towards democratic practices, preferring strong and effective centralized decision-making to messier, more inclusive processes. So this is astonishing to me, but less than half of Americans who identify with the political center view elections as, quote, an essential feature of democracy. That's, and only half of them, or 25% of centrists, agree that civil rights are crucial to democracy. So there is this other form of apathy towards the concept of democracy that's very dangerous. And I think for me, where I was coming from was a sort of different place. And I think the skepticism I felt is pretty common. And I think it's because people don't encounter democracy very often in their everyday life, right? Most people don't have democracy on the job. People don't have democracy in their schools. So it's this concept that we kind of revere and pay tribute to, and yet we do very little of it in our lives, right? It's just sort of cast your vote and go away, go home. So this is where I just want to kick us off from, not to answer the question, what is democracy? But rather to remind us of how urgent the challenge is of getting people to even ask it or to think that it connects with them in a genuine way. Because I think a goal is to expand the circle of who feels connected to the term and who is engaged in that questioning with us. And because once you make the kind of leap and you become a kind of democracyophile, which I've kind of become, it's easy to forget that disconnection. And it's easy to kind of become a bit sanctimonious or scolding, why don't people pay attention? Why don't people participate? Why don't people vote? And I hear this often from people who, when they hear that I've made a film about democracy. And, and those are decent questions. They always call to mind, there's a great quote from the philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau in The Social Contract, and he says, I just want to read it. He says, in a well-ordered city, every man flies to the assemblies. Excuse the sexist language. Under a bad government, no one cares to stir a step to get to them. So, we don't even have assemblies. People go to vote, and people are certainly not flying to the polls, right? Can you imagine a democracy where people are as enthusiastic about voting, let alone more intensive, robust forms of self-government, and they fly to these meetings or these encounters as enthusiastically as we go to lunch? I mean, that's a utopian vision. So, people often, again, there's this kind of sanctimony, and people come up to me and they're like, can you believe that people don't even vote? And I think my position is that we have to begin by going, yeah, I personally do understand why people are disengaged. And I think we have to understand it as a symptom of the fact that we don't have democracy to begin with. I spoke to a lot of strangers when I was making my film. I finally got to ask people about these issues. And what I found is that when I listened to them, to bring up listening again, their reasoning for being for not engaging were not necessarily convincing to me, but also not totally incoherent. So there's a scene that you'll see in the movie. I'm going to give you some behind the scenes intel on my movie. But there's a scene of streeters in Miami, and it's a sort of fast-moving scene, and there's one moment, and I ask these two young guys, and it's like, do you vote? And they say, no, never. But after, and when we sort of like got up, I pursued the conversation with them, and they had some interesting points. These guys were probably like 10 years old in 2000. And do you remember 2000, the Florida election? They were in Miami. There's this whole thing about hanging chads. So hanging chads made an impression on them. That was an election where the popular vote went to Al Gore, but 4 votes on the Supreme Court decided the election. One guy also said, he was just like, registering to vote is a joke. Why do you have to register in 2016? Which is also a totally fair point, right? He was just like, it should be automatic, it should be easy, and so he actually had a pretty astute analysis. He was just, it had just made him cynical. So, part of what I want to do is like challenge the charade that voting is the sacred ritual when our society does so much to undermine it, make it difficult. We've got issues of, issues of fair representation go back all the way to like the levelers and the English Revolution, right? How do we form our ridings and districts? How do we count votes fairly? And today we see the issue of electoral reform as one that people care about, but is being pushed off the political agenda. So I think we just need to, acknowledge people's cynicism and get a conversation started about these bigger issues. And going further still, my film challenges the shibboleth that elections and voting are the apex of democracy or even democratic at all. And so there's a scene where a wonderful scholar talks about the fact that the ancient Athenians thought that elections were aristocratic, not democratic, because the rich and the well-born had an advantage, and we certainly see that, right? So what they used was sortition. They devised these technologies of randomness so that, the people who were included as citizens, which of course included, slaves and women and foreigners, it was not a democracy by modern standards, but they still employed this very interesting model of sortition to ward against corruption and oligarchy. And they would certainly think that we are living in an oligarchy today. And there's an interesting book that's about to come out called Legislature by Lot, that actually all of these scholars debating sortition, and they propose, for example, they're like, what if we had a political system where there are 2 houses and one was elected and the other was selected? Because there's a lot of decent research that shows that citizens actually can come together and become informed about complex issues pretty quickly and make good decisions. And of course, they're not gunning to, attract donors and get reelected because they're not professionals in that sense. So anyway, in a nutshell, this is where I'm at after years of working on this project. I'm both more committed to small d democracy than I was at the beginning, but I'm also more sympathetic to people's disengagement. So I think the challenge, again, is calling people into the circle of democratic inquiry. And I did begin skeptical about democracy. I thought maybe this film will lead me to want something new, a different word. But I've come to see the concept's vagueness as a source of strength and its protean character as something that that can constantly be expanded. Of course, the practice of democracy doesn't come from the ancient Athenians, but the word does. And the word is, the people, the demos, hold power, kratia. And so that question of who the people is and how they hold power, how they rule, is, these are concepts that can constantly evolve and change and advance, and democracy can expand. And so perfect democracy, as the book title says, right, democracy may not exist. Perfect democracy may not exist, but yet we can democratize our society, our politics, and make progress. And of course, that progress can also go into reverse. So the challenge that I took up with this film and the book is getting people to ask the question of what is democracy with me, and not just answer it. And I'm a very pedantic person. I have all sorts of answers. Like, I have all sorts of solutions I'd like, from small ones to big ones, and instinctively for me, the word should flies out of my mouth like people flying to the assembly in Rousseau's Paradise. Like, people, you should do this, you should do that. I know the answers. And what changed me was becoming an organizer. I finally was like, I need to put my big theories into practice. I need to actually do political work. So for the last 7 years, I've been working on a project called the Debt Collective, which is a debtors union. Just like a labor union allows workers to collaborate and collectively bargain and fight the boss, we organize debtors to connect across distance to fight their creditors, whether it's student debt, medical debt, payday loans, bail bonds, you name it. And so we launched the first ever student debt strike in the US in 2015, and we've actually won $1.2 billion of debt relief for our members. Thank you. And this experience really humbled me, because if political change was like won through being right and having the solutions and a good analysis, progressives would be winning. So now I think of democracy, this woman who talks about the lottery system in the film, she says another thing. She says, democracy is our capacity to do things together. And that is, to me, another great definition. And it's the capacity to do, and one of the things we need to do is think. We need to act, and we need to think. And I just want to end by saying, that's something that we don't really think about. When people talk to me about the problems of democracy, they often speak about education. And implicit in that is this idea of like, okay, if people have education, they'll know the facts, and then they'll vote like me, and they won't be so confused, right? So it's kind of like this, it's very oriented towards the outcome of good decision making. And this theme has already come up, so I'm very happy to be here, because it's something I've been thinking so much about as I made this film. But we instead of thinking, we emphasize speaking. So there's an obsession in North America, especially the United States, with speech, with freedom of speech. There's of course like the deliberative tradition, and it becomes like speech without thought, right? Reactive speech, angry speech. I can say what I want to say, and I think, listening really deserves to be at the center. And so the film does try to embody a politics of listening. And there's, I often thought of the Stoic philosopher Epictetus, who was a Greek Stoic, and he has this great phrase, and he says, we were given 2 ears and 1 mouth so that we can listen twice as much as we speak. And I would just add to that, and we have a brain between our ears so we can process and reflect before we do that speaking. And so I think, democracy requires thinking, but that thinking requires listening. And so my film, Leah and I really tried to model an intellectual film that shows intellectual engagement as pondering, not pontificating, right? Not speaking authoritatively, but listening intently. And of course, there's this question of who gets asked questions and who gets listened to, and that's something we could talk about in the Q&A tonight. But this is the Socratic mode. Socrates famously went around and asked people, what is justice? What's the good life, right? What do you think? How do we want to live? And so, the film kind of embodies that spirit. And I think that if we do this, if we engage in thinking about democracy, we'll realize that a lot of the problems we face didn't begin this year. It's, the rise of right-wing populism, or however we phrase it, is not some new phenomenon, right? Struggles over inclusion, economic equality, expanding the demos go back to the very beginnings of democracy. We have to wrestle with these old dilemmas anew. And I just want to end with a thought from Danielle Allen, who is a classicist. And she said, and she just was like, yeah, democracy is intellectually hard. This is actually I think this is, a core facet of democracy. Because at the center of democracy is this idea of the people. And the people is an abstraction. If you live in a monarchy, you can point to the king or point to the queen and say they rule. They're the people who make the decisions. But in a democracy, we have this abstract thing that doesn't quite exist, the people coming together and making decisions. So it demands that we engage in theoretical reflections, right? And that we all be philosophers. And for me, what makes democracy so compelling, and why I wanted to explore it in film, is because it is that. It's both thinking and action. It's a noun and a verb. And I think it's, and it's something that we can only do together. So I hope you accept our invitation to think with us and come see the film tonight. And we'll take it from there. The timing, did I do good on time? Yes. Okay, I cut like half. I just wanted to keep us going.
Can we start with a high five?
Yeah. Yeah. Hello, everybody. I can actually see you now. All right. Yeah, better.
See, this was just a little microcosm of what needs to happen in democracy. Sometimes you have to move things that are intended to help you out of the way.
Yes, yes. Get rid of obstacles.
We're just trying to, you know.
So can I kick us off?
Please.
So I was very excited when I found out I was paired with Michael because of your. I saw you speak on the internet about intergenerational love, and I think one thing. This is a phrase that I had never heard before, never really thought about it, so I was wondering if you could talk about that. But I think it's something that I sort of attempted to embody without having that term in the film, in the sense that you get the sense of history, that we have allies who no longer exist, who have tried to advance freedom and equality, and that democracy is this multi-generational effort. Like, no more of this, war between the old and the young. But yeah, I was very interested in that idea and why it's so important to you and what it means for democracy.
Well, I think it's super important for us to be able to challenge narratives that are common. And so my mother went to Indian residential school, and I myself am a product of the child welfare system. And so family separation is something that has been a part of my family's story and my nation's story for too long. And so when people learn those pieces about me, they're like, oh, Michael, intergenerational trauma. Yeah. And that's a real thing. It's true. It's not fun to experience. But one thing that folks don't acknowledge often enough is that Indigenous people are still here. And the fact that we are still here is evidence and proof that intergenerational love is much stronger than intergenerational trauma. And I think that if we are going to save democracy, if we are going to get real about it, then we have to get real about the intergenerational relationships we have with one another, but also how does that act out? Like, how are we doing succession planning? How are we engaging younger folks to build relationships with those that have the experience? And that's what we do with our politics initiatives with AYO. And we even have an initiative on Friday nights called Meet Me at the Bell Tower, where it's like intergenerational awesomeness. Mm-hmm. And we welcome families to come hang out together, and we talk about solutions. And so, I just think it's really important as we have these conversations to make sure that we're rebuilding families, because for too long in this country especially, family separation has been the norm. And if we prioritize things like love, but especially intergenerational love, then I think we can be the medicine.
Yeah. Right, and so much of what, it also changes one question that I got into. So in the companion book, I get much more abstract. And so there's a question, each chapter is a paradox that democracy has to wrestle with. So, how coercion versus choice, how much spontaneity versus how much structure. And then the spatial questions, so the local versus the global, but also the time question. What is the time of democracy? Because on the one hand, democracy has to be quick. There's urgent challenges. But then we also need to have the long view. We need to think about generations to come and expanding the demos beyond people who are alive. Because the dead actually have a lot of say when they write the constitutions, right? And they make the laws that, like, a bunch of dead old white men have this disproportionate power in our society over people who are alive now. So we got to disenfranchise some dead people. Sorry.
Hey, I was just a part of the process with the Bank of Canada replacing Sir John A. Macdonald on the $10 bill with Viola Desmond, a black woman. And I feel like this is real progress in Canada. Yeah. It's not impossible.
Yeah. And but so I think this issue of time is really an interesting one. And so I loved how you said it, but you manifest that work through your work with young people. And what Leah and I have been quite interested, I've done quite a few screenings, and occasionally someone who claims to love the film and love everything about it takes issue with the fact that I put young people front and center in one scene in particular. Because, it's basically like kids don't know. So there's a scene in a school where I ask students about democracy in their school, and they're quite mistreated. And the response has been, yeah, but don't they need to listen to their elders who actually have wisdom and kind of know their place? And wait till they turn 18 and magically become human. Why do youth activism, do you think that will change as you get older?
I certainly hope so. I know that the young people that I work with are passionate about learning.
Yeah.
And so the reality for Indigenous young people, unfortunately, and I think a lot of young people, is just that we are entrenched within systems where we feel we have zero control. And so I think that it's important for us, if we're going to actually mentor and eventually have these young people take over as our elected officials, as our prime ministers, as our executives, as our CEOs, on and on and on, then I don't believe that you love democracy unless you are building the system literacy and navigation skills of young people. I just don't believe it. And there are so many elected folks, and I like to do this in Winnipeg, and I like to ask them, so individual who has been elected, what kind of stuff do you do on a weekly basis to build systems literacy in your constituents? And they don't usually have an answer. But it's a great question, and I would encourage everyone to ask their elected officials, what are they doing to build system literacy? Because too many folks are benefiting from the fact that the general population doesn't understand what's going on, and then they can go to their talking points and pull the wool over people's eyes. But if you build up folks' system literacy, then we're in a position to be able to call bullshit when we need to do so.
Yeah. 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 And so what have you seen, like where are the youth going who go through the program, and what kinds of, when people become democratic citizens, I guess is my question, then what does that mean? Because it doesn't only mean becoming an elected official, right?
Well, yeah, well, it's been exciting because the young people that I work with have now, after learning about all these different systems and politics, are now able to understand how to do very complicated navigation of existing structures and also try to replace them. So in Winnipeg, we have a lot of challenges with harmful substance use right now. And so crystal meth is something that's really kind of really hurting our community right now. And so we have young people that, with the system literacy that has been built from folks that support us, we've been able to navigate the bureaucracy of systems to be able to have a culture-based program for people who use drugs that is informed by people who use drugs. And I think being able to bring those experiential voices to the table wouldn't have been possible if we didn't have helpers building our system literacy so that we understood how to even make that happen, because it was not a popular decision.
Yes.
And it still is not a popular decision, bringing those folks that are currently using those substances to give us the intel of what we need to do. But our perspective is that that's the work.
Yep.
And I think that that's the benefit. And so I think that for the young people that I work with, the movie that you've been able to put together, what is democracy, is something that, it's a question that we ask all the time. Yep. And I just wonder for you, I want to ask you a 10-year challenge question, okay? So 10 years ago, okay, you went back a little bit, but 10 years ago, did you ever imagine that you would be rah, the democracy person?
No.
What, how did you get here?
So it's 10 years. I was already the philosophy person, so maybe I was sort of halfway there. Even though philosophy was born of distrust with democracy, right? It was born with Plato saying, oh, those silly, scary Democrats that have put my mentor Socrates to death. So, I've always been interested in social justice. So when I was a kid, I had a newsletter with other children around animal rights and the environment. So, I've always been socially conscious. I think I just felt that democracy was irredeemable, that it was not a word worth fighting for. And so this process of making this film has really changed my thinking and made me connect with the concept. And I think what I had to do was undo a lot of learning about that, and undo a lot of associations, and change my idea of who. Part of it was expanding the circle of who I listen to. And so one thing the film does is try to change who's an expert. And so this is kind of what you're getting at with, bringing people into the circle. When you start talking about democracy and these issues with regular people, with people who are excluded, with people from all walks of life, there's actually so much wisdom and capacity. And so I think I started I came out of the process of making this film and feeling like, no, actually, if we gave people a chance, we maybe could make something really great. So it was kind of interesting, like as the film finished, the last week of shooting was actually the election in the United States, so Donald Trump was president, and the whole world was like, democracy's over. And I'm like having the opposite trend line. I'm like, okay, democracy, I'm for this, we could do this, which is strange. It's a sort of strange sensation to be kind of going against the grain like that. But yeah, I didn't know that this is where I'd wind up, and I honestly have no idea where I'll be in 10 years.
So, like, one of the things that is very interesting to me is the concept of influence.
Yeah.
Okay? And a lot of folks, I think, go into like becoming elected officials so that they can gain influence. I would argue that you, as a filmmaker and a storyteller, have an extremely effective way of influencing people. Yeah. And so I wonder if, do you see yourself as like a democratically positioned person? Like, do you feel like you're did you get voted in, is my question.
No, I mean, I think this issue, so I see it, so I have two answers, and I'll try to be really quick. So one is, I think films have on some of like a limited impact. So that's why I engage in organizing. I ultimately think we need to build social power and engage in, forms of adversarial politics. So for me, it's fighting for economic justice, and trying to build new forms of solidarity so that people who come from very different walks of life and are different ages and different races and different gender orientations and have different jobs see themselves as being economically exploited. So for me, organizing and engaging in political strategies like that, to me, is real power. And then the filmmaking is, again, it's in the realm of philosophy, it's creative expression, but one thing moving images do is that they represent. They're really powerful in terms of who we see and how that works on our imaginations. And that's why it's so important to show different types of expertise, to put diverse people front and center and create a container so that they can be heard and so that their insights can be valued, because there's a 12-year-old girl speaking and then the next minute there's quotes from Plato and Rousseau. So it kind of dignifies everyone and makes, and I think creates a sort of mood in the audience so they can really hear the brilliance that is being expressed from people they maybe wouldn't otherwise listen to. W.E.B. Du Bois, who's the scholar of Reconstruction, has this beautiful phrase in an essay called Of the Ruling of Men, which I recommend, and he talks about excluded wisdom and how democracy needs the excluded wisdom of Black people, working people, women. He actually talks about children. And I think that, the film sort of does that. So film is powerful because it reaffirms all sorts of stereotypes or can break those stereotypes, but it's not organizing and it's not the end all be all. So for me, I have to have both aspects in my life.
Love it.
Okay. Thank you. Hey, thank you, Michael.